In this video, Jordan Peterson explains how your desires are in conflict with each other all the time.
And Freud's theory, and this is where it differs from the theories that we talked about earlier, say with regards to Piaget, Freud's theory is really more about control. He thought of all of these potential subsystems and memories conflicting with each other, like a war, like a Hobbesian war. So Hobbes was the philosopher who said that life is nasty, brutal, and short, and that in the state of nature everyone is at war with everyone else. And so you need a Leviathan, a top-down control system, a Leviathan, who will punish any deviance from the social contract. Well, that's the Freudian superego. Now, Freud thought of the unconscious and the conscious mind to begin with, but later he dissociated that up into id, ego, and superego. And then he thought that each of those had their unconscious elements. So, if you're under the grip of an id-related subpersonality, let's say, you can be conscious of that, but there's the possibility for all sorts of other id-related subpersonalities to emerge, so those would be in your unconscious. And it's also possible, and highly likely in fact, that the way that you're perceiving the world and the way you're acting in it, and even what you state as your goals, are influenced in ways that you don't understand by the action of these unconscious systems. So for example, maybe some of you are headed for medical school, and if I ask you why, you'll give me 6 humanitarian reasons, but the actual reason is because, your grandmother would be disappointed if you weren't. And she might not even be alive anymore. Your mother may have imitated your grandmother so that ideal is firmly embodied in her, and that set up the unspoken expectations about your behavior ever since you were a tiny child. So that's an interesting sub-element of psychodynamic theory too, and it's really something to watch for in your personal relationships. It's very, very frequently, if you watch carefully, that you can see someone, especially someone you love, because you have to know them well, being taken over in some sense by the spirit of one of their ancestors. And I don't mean this in a metaphysical way. I mean that the thought, the personality of the grandmother or the personality of the mother has a structure that's well known to the individual in question. And that individual spent a lot of time imitating them in all sorts of ways. And those imitated structures can be passed down generation to generation. I mean, in fact, that's partly what constitutes your culture, right? It's the imitated personality of all of your ancestors that constitutes your culture. And those things can possess you. Ideologies possess you in not exactly the same way, but in a very similar way. So, okay, so you've got the id and you've got the ego and the superego, and as in the Hobbesian worldview, there's real tension between them. So the id is always trying to get its base gratifications, its base desires gratified. Now, in Freudian times, that was mostly problematic in relationship to sex. And the reasons for that are quite clear. There was no valid birth control. There was very little employment option for women, so their sexual behavior had to be very, very, very tightly regulated, or they'd fall outside of the social structure into prostitution or something like that. And then there was the threat of various venereal diseases, most particularly syphilis, which is as awful a disease as you can imagine. It can mimic all sorts of other diseases, and it's transmissible from mother to child. So it's a nasty one. So it was very difficult for the Victorians to integrate sexuality because, well, exactly how did you do that? The one pathway to potential integration, something the superego, say, would approve of, was a marital pathway. But, people back then, in the 1960s, people were getting married around, 19 or 20, but that's actually a historical anomaly. I mean, typically speaking, in the Victorian age, a man usually couldn't afford to get married till he was in his mid to late 20s. He just didn't have the resources. And women were married usually younger than that. But so there was a long period of time, for men particularly, but also for women, where the sexual drive, from a Freudian perspective, was fully flourishing, fully manifesting itself, but there was no socially approved mode of expression. And so under those conditions, there's a war between the id and the superego in a sense, and the poor little ego is crushed in the middle. Now you could certainly see that when we were watching the movie, the Crumb Brothers movie, because they were basically in the same situation, right? There was no socially approved way that they could manifest any sexual or any aggressive behavior. And what happened as a consequence was that both of those fundamental subpersonalities, let's call them, become incredibly pathologized, particularly characterized by resentment and the desire for revenge. Because remember, these systems think, if someone's excruciatingly sexually frustrated, let's say, and let's think about it in the broader scheme of things, because sexuality isn't really, it's not a narrow, unidimensional drive. It's associated with playfulness, and it's associated with the desire for social contact, and the desire for communication, and the desire for touch, and it's a complicated, multi-branching phenomena. Well, in the case of the people who we were watching in the movie, none of that was either integrated into their personalities, let's say, or permitted by society. And so it was bent and warped and frustrated, and then generated all sorts of ideas about resentment and revenge around it. So you can develop an incredibly pathological subpersonality. In the one cartoon, if you remember, when it was the one that was most disturbing, where Mr. Natural brought Robert that headless woman. So he wanted pure gratification without responsibility. So it's a really id-driven phenomena. And so he had intercourse with her, and immediately after that was unbelievably guilty. And you can see, so you think about what that must mean. It's like someone is under the grip of one subpersonality, and it's shaping all of their thoughts and their memories and their emotions. And all of a sudden that becomes gratified, so it's satiated, it disappears, and bang, up comes the other one. And it's, in this particular example, it was guilt and shame and anxiety, terror even, and self-loathing, all of those things. And if you read about the experiences of people who commit particularly atrocious crimes, it's very, very common for them to experience exactly that. They're driven by sexual/aggressive impulses, because those are generally the ones that culminate in the particularly atrocious, individual crimes. And they'll commit them, and then they instantly flip back into their normative personality, except they're absolutely terrified by what they did. And, it's more than one person is inhabiting the same psyche. And it's now, they're tied together by memory, generally speaking, although Freud would say you can also dissociate memory. And so Freud talked about memories being repressed. And that's caused an awful lot of trouble because, for a whole variety of reasons. Because memory is not the objective recording. It's not the objective, unbiased recording of actually occurring events. First of all, because you can't actually objectively record certain kinds of events, like we talked about this before. You can't really objectively record a discussion between a man and a woman who've been married for 20 years about anything important, because for them, each word and each phrase and each sentence and each facial expression has to be interpreted within the context of the entire relationship in order for the meaning of the utterances to be extracted. And there's just no way you can record that in a video. You'd have to have videoed the entire relationship. And so you're not going to do that. And so memory is a very, very peculiar thing. And the idea that you could have an objective record is not a very sophisticated idea.